Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
From the September 30th resignations to the President's alternative pay plan, federal employees are facing a wave of structural changes. Add in court challenges to Trump-era terminations and the unraveling of collective bargaining, and the stakes for civil service protections feel extraordinarily high. Here to talk through the details is Staff Vice President for Policy and Programs at NARF, John Hatton. John, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, let's start with the end of September coming up. Many things are supposed to happen by the end of September, but one that probably will is the termination of government employment for folks who took the fork in the road. When they took that back in March or April, it might have seemed like it was a long way off, but now it's not. By the end of September, those folks will be off the rolls either as retirees or resignees. So what is NARF telling folks at this point about how to prepare for that?
Well, it depends on your status, if you're resigning and trying to find other employment or if you're retiring. And so at this point, people probably should have started to prepare for retirement, have a retirement date of September 30th. Some people who might have become eligible for retirement between September 30th and the end of the year might have gotten an extension on that retirement date, but you want to prepare for a little bit of a waiting game potentially in terms of the processing of your retirement application. We won't know the full amount of retirements that come from that total of deferred resignation program acceptees until OPM announces it and releases that information. So that may be sometime in October. But we expect a large number and significantly higher than the typical monthly claim, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe even 10 times higher than the normal amount of claims they get in a month. OPM had people who took that deferred resignation program in their retirement services division. They have less staff to handle these applications. Hopefully people have gotten this through, but I think even agencies have had limits with their HR benefit officers. So it needs to get through from the agency to OPM and processed. OPM has developed a online retirement application. Hopefully that will speed up processing. We saw a slight uptick in the number of claims processed in August, but if we're looking at something like 5 times the number of claims they usually receive, we don't know. And it's also a new system. So, typically we tell people 60, 90 days to wait for that full annuity. You should get some interim payment, but given the circumstances, it could be a lot longer. But certainly trying to prepare for all the logistics, make sure if you haven't submitted that retirement application, you're going through, checking all the boxes. We'll have a webinar for some people coming up next week for them to sit through and watch and really kind of check off all the different boxes of decisions, whether it's your federal health benefits, your FEGLI, your spousal or survivor annuities, and things like that.
Lots to think about as folks are coming up on that deadline. In other news about the federal workforce, if you're not going to be leaving it, the president proposed an alternative pay plan at the end of August. Tell us about the details there.
Yeah, so the alternative pay plan would have a 1% across the board increase to federal pay rates, though for some law enforcement would get a 3.8% increase. That 3.8% is based on the changes in private sector wages and salaries from the year prior, and it's the basis for the military pay raise. So the 1% is really 2.8 percentage points below market, and given inflation, given likely increases in health benefits, given the potential increased workload through these reductions in force, it really looks more like a pay freeze or a pay decrease in real terms.
And they're also freezing locality pay, correct?
Correct. And this is all stipulation that Congress doesn't do anything through the appropriations process to change that. The alternative pay plan is necessary to prevent that 3.3% increase and a locality pay increase that would bridge the gap between private sector pay and federal pay, which stands at nearly 25% higher for the private sector. So that pay plan, if Congress does nothing, will then go into effect. Needs to be an executive order at the end of the year, and certain locality pay proclamations in December as well. So we don't expect that to change at this point, but Congress could have a say We'll see what happens in the appropriations process. I think it's unlikely for that 1% to change through Congress changing it.
I'm speaking with John Hatton. He's Staff Vice President at the National Active and Retired Federal Employees Association, NARF. Well, John, tell us about what's going on with some of the court cases that are out there. States brought a case to direct the government to rehire folks. That just got turned down, but the union cases are still alive. Kind of what's the status for folks as they're watching these?
So definitely challenges for lack of standing, and that was the reasoning for the appeals court rejecting the state's argument. And a lot of this is, individuals have a right to appeal their terminations through the Merit Systems Protection Board. And so when you get into these broader challenges to kind of the global actions, it becomes a little bit more difficult to challenge them in court. We've seen union actions on AFG had a lawsuit on reductions in force, the executive order and memorandum that eventually got overturned, that won at the district court level but got overturned at the Ninth Circuit level, or even by the Supreme Court as well, that sent it back down to the lower courts. So that did not necessarily preclude individuals challenging terminations through the Merit Systems Protection Board. It did not necessarily preclude challenges to agency actions in these reductions in forces that didn't follow proper procedures. So I don't think we've seen the end of the story on these court challenges, but I think there's been larger challenges on the class-based attempts to block these actions, and it's going to, I think, more often need to go through that Merit Systems Protection Board process.
Well, it seems like one argument for collective bargaining might be the fact that the unions have been at least somewhat more successful in these cases, but the Trump administration has continued to terminate collective bargaining across federal agencies. What's the latest there?
So the latest was wrapping in a few additional agencies into what was a previous executive order that eliminated collective bargaining at federal agencies based on national security grounds. So National Weather Service, NASA, NOAA were all wrapped into essentially the same policy of claiming that due to national security reasons, these collective bargaining agreements are no longer valid, and federal employees no longer have collective bargaining rights at those agencies. Now, that's received a lot of pushback. There's been challenges in court that have been successful at first and then rolled back, even when the administration and court argued that they're not going to then curtail those collective bargaining agreements after the fact. After the court's order, they did so anyway. In the meantime, there's efforts in Congress to nullify that executive order. There's a discharge petition in the House for a bill that would nullify the original executive order that is close to the 218 needed. I know discharge petitions are getting a lot of attention recently and some other topics, but if you get 218 on a discharge petition, you can force a vote in the House. That doesn't necessarily get you to the Senate. Meanwhile, there's a provision in the National Defense Authorization Act that would nullify it related to the Department of Defense workforce. So there's efforts in Congress to try to block this, to try to roll back the executive order. Meanwhile, the administration is moving forward with expanding its use of these national security ground exceptions, while this also continues to play out in court, mostly in the administration's favor at the moment. But again, this is another one that continues to develop as we move forward.
I've been speaking with John Hatton. He's Staff Vice President of the National Active and Retired Federal Employees Association. John, thanks for joining me and thanks for your insights.
Thank you for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.